Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how U.S. government policy could impact your bottom line. I'm your host, Madison Mills. President Trump speaking to global leaders and corporate executives from the World Economic Forum, reiterating his stance on tariffs.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply, you will have to pay a tariff.
We'll take you through the latest policy positions coming from the White House and the implications for your wallet. Plus, we'll be joined by Wharton School professor Zeke Hernandez to discuss Trump's executive orders on immigration and how they could affect the workforce and the broader economy. But before we get too into it, let me introduce my co-stars, Ben Werschkul and Julie Hyman. Hello, Ben and Julie. Welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Ben, let's start with you. What's top of mind for you this week?
For sure. Top of mind for me, you mentioned tariffs right at the top there. There's sort of 20 more themes from this incredibly busy week of Trump 2.0 that we could go through. The through line in my mind is kind of Trump as market mover, the actions he's taken this week that appear sort of to have had an effect on the markets, but also I think from Trump team's perspective, that's part of the point, is that they have an effect on markets. The first trend here is this tariffs one you mentioned. We saw Trump at Davos reiterate his tariffs plans, but over the course of the week, he first started by downplaying tariffs on day one. There was no big action. And then in the rest of the week, he's threatened tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China, the European Union, and Russia, all in the course of just a few days. So it's sort of clear that there's competing impulses here for Trump to kind of not sort of over like put the markets on the defensive by talking big on tariffs, but he clearly can't help himself. The second is kind of an outreach to tech and a lot of AI name checking. We saw that Tuesday with the touting of a joint venture that Trump says that will invest up to $500 billion for artificial intelligence. That clearly had an effect on the markets. It goosed stocks like Oracle, which is one of the partners there, and then Nvidia. But that's kind of came even as there's a range of questions we can get into about exactly what there is on this project. Elon Musk raised a bunch of questions of it too. There's questions about kind of what's new here beyond the name, which is Stargate. And then the third is Trump's virtual address to Davos on Thursday. That I think kind of underlined these competing impulses for him, trying to thread the needle. You saw market-friendly talk from the market side. He touted Stargate. He talked about deregulation. He talked about energy, but he also got into these kind of testier issues, tariffs he brought up again, and talking about demanding lower interest rates for the markets, which has been a big focus of conversation. So that's just the start. I looked and we have about 1,450 days left in Trump 2.0, but this is sort of some early hints. What else do you notice, Julie?
1,450 days. That makes it seem so long, Ben. Of course, I've been watching a lot of the same things that you have, and it's remarkable to me that given that there are so many things that we still don't know, the vibes in the market have seemed to be relatively good, all else being equal, right? It strikes me, though, I spoke with Mohammed El-Arian earlier in the week. He, of course, is president at Queen's College at Cambridge and an advisor to Allianz market veteran. And he said there are really 5 areas that investors want to be watching for more clarity. One of them is energy, which I would argue probably among these is where we have more clarity than not. Immigration, trade, which of course includes tariffs, deregulation, and then what he termed as fiscal, sort of what is fiscal policy going to look like? What will taxes look like? For example, what will relief look like on that front? And so there is still, even though it has been a very busy week for this young administration, there's still an awful lot that we don't know. To your point, we don't know what's going to happen on tariffs specifically. And the market definitely wants to know that, probably more urgently, I would say, than any of those other issues. We know that Trump wants to open up drilling, for example. He signed some executive orders to that effect, has an energy emergency. But will U.S. oil and gas companies take the bait and actually do more drilling? They're already at record production, and if they over drill, it could perhaps jeopardize some of their profitability. So there's still a lot of questions.
I do want to continue our conversation on tariffs. I thought it was really interesting at the World Economic Forum that all of these corporate executives, global business leaders had the opportunity, a few of them, to ask Trump questions. And we didn't necessarily get clarity from Trump about the specifics when it comes to tariffs. He got a little bit more specific when talking about corporate tax cuts. He answered a question from Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan to that end, talking about how companies that do produce products in the United States can expect to see corporate tax rates around 15%. But the big question that I know you both know well is this idea that Trump can control tariffs. He can't control tax cuts himself. He would have to go through Congress for that. And he does have a slim majority in the House. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not he is actually able to complete that sort of promise that he is making to corporate America. Regardless, though, the market running with that optimism, we saw right after Trump made those comments, we did see a huge lift to the upside in stocks. And I think it's interesting in the context of the fact that we don't have that clarity on tariffs yet. He talked a lot more about Mexico and Canada at the World Economic Forum as well. He was asked about China and said that he wants a fair relationship with Beijing.
He has gotten opportunities and questions specifically about China and what the relationship is going to be like. And he hasn't taken the bait in terms of offering any more level of specificity.
Yeah, no, I think he's very much in the kind of in the deal maker mode, or in his mind deal maker mode on this front too. He talked about how he met with Xi, he talked on the phone with Xi last week, and they covered a lot of this stuff. And what's clear to me is that there's a lot of interrelated issues, and kind of how it shakes out will be part of it. Tariffs being the big one, but TikTok is another big one. He's mentioned the war in Ukraine and sort of getting China involved there too. So, you know, as you mentioned, Julie, like the markets really want the answer on the tariff side of this, but what's clear is that he's kind of holding his fire on that in terms of what he's going to do on China, even if he does some of these tariffs on February 1st, while the other ones are kind of full guns ahead. I wrote this week about how Canada is, and you saw it at the speech at the World Economic Forum, is that Canada is his kind of enemy number one, which in a lot of ways is really surprising given what we've heard from the campaign.
Well, Ben, not to be grilling you here, but can you talk about your reporting on why Canada is so top of mind for Trump right now, given that what the market probably really wants clarity on is more coming from China?
Yeah, exactly. So this has been a question that's really been interesting to me ever since the election, because up until Canada barely came up. It was China and it was Mexico, which have been Trump's kind of public enemies, especially on the tariff front, for years now. But Canada has sort of taken this front role, and there's kind of three answers to your question of what's going on here. First is what Trump says, which is that this is about drugs and fentanyl, and what he's promised is 25% tariffs in response to both for Canada and Mexico in response to this issue. But when you look at the data, it doesn't quite add up. You know, the apprehensions at the northern border are by some measure 1/60th of what you get on the southern border, and the same with fentanyl. Whenever the Drug Enforcement Administration had a whole report on drug threats, and Canada didn't come up. And Canada, the way they describe fentanyl in Canada is that it goes there for the Canadian market, most of anything. So it's clearly something more going on, even though that's Trump. The second answer you get is what policy wonks say, which is that USMCA is going to be negotiated, and that was one of Trump's most comprehensive concrete things he did in this first week, is that he kind of began the review process of that. It's not expected to be until 2026, but his move this week could actually move that up. And then the third is what's clearly at play here is kind of personal issues here. He clearly does not like Justin Trudeau. He revels in the fact that he was kind of helped to push Justin Trudeau from power, and he's now that there's now elections to replace him. So there's a kind of personal element that I think is here with Trump. When he talks about Xi, he talks about how much he likes Xi, how much he respects Xi. When he talks about Canada, as he did at the World Economic Forum, he talks about how difficult they are. So there's all those things that are kind of in the mix here that's made it really interesting with Canada.
Well, and there's always the questions of whether he's shooting himself in the foot or shooting America in the foot, I guess, because
whether it's rational or not.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was so fascinating to hear the Alcoa CEO talk on that company's earnings call this week, and really calling out the issue of aluminum imports to the United States. Now, Alcoa makes some of its aluminum in Canada, but so do other companies. And guess who imports that? U.S. manufacturers, including U.S. automakers. And so the Alcoa CEO, William Opplinger, said that tariffs on Canadian aluminum would represent a threat to U.S. industrial competitiveness. I thought that was really interesting and pointed. And it's going to be something that, you know, I'm sure the automakers are paying attention to, and that we're going to have to watch.
And it's something that seems to apply to a lot of different sectors. Obviously, you bring up autos. It's this question of whether or not we're going to see national security or economic dominance kind of being the main theme of the day here. This came up, of course, with the banning of TikTok, and it was a national security issue. Now suddenly it's not. It's something that's come up with regards to chips this week, as well. As early as today, we heard the Dutch premier talking about how he expects Donald Trump to push hard on ASML export controls. As a reminder, this is that Dutch semiconductor company. And this question is as to whether or not we are going to continue to see export controls amongst these chips names continuing to be a headwind for those companies as we head into this administration. I know, Julie, that you have reported a lot on these different chips names and the impact that they could see under this administration. We saw a huge lift to the upside in these names this week after news of that Stargate project that Ben mentioned earlier, and then a little bit of pressure after this news of potential export controls.
Well, I think there's also just a lot of questions about how that big Stargate project is going to work. I mean, Elon Musk's questions notwithstanding, there are others who've raised questions about how the funding is going to work. SoftBank is a huge entity that has raised a lot of money. OpenAI has raised a lot of money. But investors are also asking about profitability eventually of all these projects, or at least those questions are starting to sort of trickle in here. So all of that is going to be a factor. I mean, export controls and what's going to happen there, in addition to tariffs. I mean, your guess is as good as mine about what's going to happen on that front and how it's going to affect the chip makers. The positioning has sort of been, we've dealt with what's happened so far. We'll deal with whatever comes. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah, we certainly will. Well, we've got to take a quick break here at Capital Gains, but we are going to continue the conversation on the other side with Zeke Hernandez talking about immigration policy and the impact on the economy. Keep it here. Welcome back to Capital Gains. We are now joined by Wharton School professor Zeke Hernandez. Zeke, thank you so much for being here to talk with us about the first week of President Trump back in the White House as the 47th president, and specifically zeroing in on immigration, which I know you are an expert in. You are also the author of a book on immigration, which we're going to throw up here. But I wanted to just get your reaction to week one. What is top of mind for you when it comes to policy on immigration?
Yeah, so I think the question on everyone's mind is how much is bluster versus reality, right? There's been a flurry of executive orders that have come out. They've been widely covered in the news. But the question is, which ones will actually come to play? Some of them will face significant legal challenges. Ending birthright citizenship is probably the most extreme. The other question is, which ones are impractical or self-harmful for us, right? For example, deporting every single undocumented immigrant living in this country is impractical, but also it's damaging for us because you're talking about getting rid of somewhere between 12 and 13 million people who are contributing at least 5 key economic inputs for businesses in our economy, right? Those inputs are investment, they're bringing talent, consumption, they're paying taxes, and many of them actually contribute quite significantly to innovation in terms of new products and services that arise in the economy. And so local jurisdictions, right, including the very ones that many politicians have to respond to, they're going to face questions from their constituents and mayors and chambers of commerce asking, hey, we're facing labor shortages. We have a housing crisis and we can't build enough. Factories are going to close. What gives? And so I think that there's a lot of noise and a lot of questions about what will be really implemented, especially given the fact that we're in an environment where America is shrinking in terms of people, right? The only scarce resource we have in this country is lack of people because of low birth rates and high levels of retirement. And expelling people or preventing new people from coming is eliminating the key input that our economy needs.
Professor, thanks for joining us. I wanted to get sort of the timeline from you of sort of how we're going to see the economic effects here. Is there an indicator you're watching, sort of the first indication of where we're going to get signal versus this noise you're talking about when we start to see economic effects? Given that sort of much of the initial focus for rightful reasons is kind of on the humanitarian aspect of immigration, when are we going to start to feel it on the economy side?
Well, it's hard to know exactly, but I can predict 2 or 3 areas where we're going to feel it. My sense is that the very first one is going to be businesses desperately saying that they don't have enough people to do what they have to do. In fact, we're already hearing businesses say that. Okay. Remember, we're in an environment where there's a lot more job openings than people who can fill them. We're also in the next few years going to reach an environment where we get very close to more people dying than being born. And so businesses are going to do a few things, right? They're going to contract their output, okay? Or they're going to go take those jobs, if they can, overseas, which research has shown when firms face restrictions on hiring immigrant talent, they take those jobs overseas, which is precisely the opposite of what this administration is stating that they want to do. So companies complaining again about labor shortages would be the first. The other could be inflation, right? If companies have to restrict output like they did immediately after the pandemic because of the shortage of immigration we faced, among other things, also there was some overstimulation by the Biden administration, we could see inflation. Those would be probably the two most immediate. And the third would be a decline in aggregate demand. That is, businesses will have fewer consumers that are buying their products and services. And then the next one I would expect in terms of the timing would be that local jurisdictions, so cities, states, and eventually the federal government will be collecting fewer taxes because there are fewer workers and consumers in the economy. The most long-term harm that we could see would have to do with innovation. So think of, fewer patents, fewer new products and services, but that will take much longer.
I have seen, it's Julie here. I have seen some speculation that after this sort of initial wave of deportations, that there could be some sort of change in immigration policy that would still allow a flow of legal immigrants into the country, maybe to address some of the issues that you're talking about. Also, of course, the president has expressed willingness to continue the H-1B visa program because a lot of his friends in Silicon Valley are a fan of that program. So I guess I would ask, do you see those kinds of better case scenarios potentially unfolding?
Yeah, so that's one of the open questions that I didn't mention at the beginning, but is, so far everything that's been announced is very kind of enforcement and safety related. What is going to happen in terms of actually changing the immigration system, right? So are we going to expand legal pathways for unskilled immigrants, for skilled immigrants? The administration is signaling, like you mentioned with the example of the H-1B visa, that they're more open to at least preserving or expanding pathways for skilled immigrants, particularly those with STEM-like skills. The question, though, is that it's very hard to separate skilled from unskilled immigration. Often we separate those two, right? And there's a school of thought out there that, hey, look, we want all the engineers, right, and all the skilled people that are highly educated, but we don't want the unskilled people. Many of those jobs are being filled by undocumented immigrants, but you can't really separate them. Think about any company, right? If you work for a company like Amazon, right? Amazon definitely needs engineers from India and China to fill many of the technical jobs. But if it doesn't have unskilled workers to deliver or to work in the warehouses, Amazon can't function, right? So even within companies, you can't separate the two. Certainly in any community, for it to function properly, you definitely need skilled people. You also need people doing things like household cleaning, farming, babysitting, filling the job at a fast food restaurant. And so you can't really separate the two. They go together. So immigration reform needs to consider those two things. I worry a little bit that the administration is overly focused on skilled but not unskilled labor needs.
And Zeke, when I was able to sit in on your seminar at Wharton, you talked about specific examples that you study and talk about in the book with regards to domestic laborers and this idea that a crackdown on immigration leads to higher employment levels in the United States. Can you talk me through one of those examples as sort of illustrative about the dynamic when it comes to crackdowns on immigration and the impact that has on our labor market?
Sure. And yeah, that's not just a theoretical issue. We have very good empirical evidence on this. If we go kind of to the most recent past, the Obama administration actually deported a lot of people through the Secure Communities program, even more than the first Trump administration. And there's a study that has shown that for every million people deported through that program, 88,000 Americans lost jobs. We can go further back into history during the Great Depression, thinking that they would protect and preserve jobs for American workers. Many politicians implemented a program to deport about half of all Mexican Americans residing in the United States. The result was that U.S. workers lost jobs, and those that were able to find jobs actually found worse jobs than before because there were worse jobs available because the economy had contracted because of the loss of those people. In 1924, there was a law that severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and banned it from all of Asia. And that created also a loss of jobs, created a significant loss of innovation. For example, US-born scientists experienced a 68% decline in patenting productivity. So every time we have tried to restrict or eliminate immigration, we have suffered an own goal, right? American workers and American businesses have suffered.
Professor, are there aspects of Trump's orders this week that I think people are not focused on from the business effects? One I was reading about this week was that the designation of foreign cartels as terrorist organization actually could bleed over into the legal economy in lots of unpredictable ways. Is that something you're focused on, or are there other things that people might not be thinking about top of mind that they should be in terms of the economic fallout?
Yeah, so I think that basically, let me go back to what I stated with the 5 fingers of my hand, right? The 5 things that immigrants bring. And let me repeat them. They're investment, talent, and consumption, innovation, and taxes. Most of the conversation when it comes to the economy is about talent or jobs, right? That is, if you believe that immigrants are taking jobs from native workers, which they don't, the evidence is quite clear on that. You might think, oh, this is going to create more job openings for natives. It turns out that it's the opposite based on the evidence I just stated. The problem is that most people fail to talk about the other 4. We're not talking about losing millions of consumers. Right? We're not talking about losing millions of innovators. We're not talking about the taxes that are forgone at both the local and federal level. And we're not talking about the investment capital that immigrants bring, both because they attract money from businesses from their home countries, but also because they're 80% more likely to start businesses than native-born people. And the businesses started by immigrants create more jobs than the businesses started by natives.
This reminds me of a story that Bloomberg did this week about Chicago, a much bigger city that gets its second largest tax base in terms of the areas of the city behind the Magnificent Mile is an area that is very immigrant heavy, a lot of Latin immigrants. And then it was what they called a veritable ghost town because of fear. It was cold also, but also because of fear over what was coming. So how does one calculate the potential GDP effects of these immigration orders?
Yeah, I think you have to add up sort of the aggregate effect of those 5 things. But one example is that the CBO calculated, well, this is now about a couple of years old, but we had what the CBO called bonus immigration during the Biden administration, right? That bonus immigration, of course, has been very controversial. But the CEO came out with a very impressive and strong report saying that bonus immigration would make the economy bigger by trillions of dollars over the next decade, right? The CBO literally quantified the effect that a few extra million more immigrants would have had. It also calculated that the federal government would collect billions and billions of dollars more in taxes. And so, again, these aren't hypotheticals. These are things that can be easily quantified. And if anything, we underestimate those effects. I'll tell you why. If you take the example of Chicago and taxes that you just gave, that's just accounting for the direct taxes that those immigrants pay. It's not accounting for the corporate taxes that companies pay because they're able to invest more, because they're able to grow more. And so when you combine individual income taxes with corporate taxes, the tax effect of immigrants, just as one example, is much bigger than we assume.
Really important overview. Zeke Hernandez, thank you so much for joining us. Zeke is with the Wharton School as a professor, also the author of The Truth About Immigration, Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers. Thanks. That's all for this episode of Capital Gains. Thank you again to Zeke Hernandez, Julie Hyman, and Ben Werschkul for being here. And thank you all for listening. Make sure to subscribe and like Capital Gains wherever you get your podcasts.